New at 4, we are hearing from a witness who says he saw comedian Katt Williams beat a store clerk in Hall County. Channel 2's Tom Regan is live in Gainesville, where he says it all started with a stack of cash. Tom, this is just bizarre.
The comedian was arrested at his home yesterday during a raid. He had hoped to get out of the jail this afternoon, but authorities filed a new charge against him that for the time being will keep him behind bars.
Hollywood has always been a place where the spotlight blinds the audience from seeing the shadows that lurk just beyond the stage. But every so often, those shadows break free, and what they reveal is darker than anyone ever imagined. And this time the storm has a name: Katt Williams, the same man millions once celebrated as a raw, fearless comic, now being accused of something so chilling it could rewrite his entire legacy. Because according to leaked reports, insider testimony, and damning confessions, Williams wasn't simply caught up in chaos. He was orchestrating it, plotting in silence, while the world laughed at his unpredictable persona. And at the center of this storm lies the shocking murder of Reggie Carroll, a seasoned comedian whose life was cut short on August 20th inside Onyx LLC, the flashy clothing brand tied directly to Katt's empire, transforming what should been a symbol of luxury and power into a crime scene that rocked Hollywood, leaving fans, insiders, and investigators asking why a veteran comic, once described as family within Katt's tour, would end up dead inside his empire. But the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that Reggie was not the beginning. He was not the first to face this kind of silence, because before his name echoed across headlines, there was another figure almost forgotten by the public: Corey Dixon, a man who, according to new testimony, became the very first target in a chilling pattern of violence that tied back to Katt himself, a man who allegedly stumbled onto a dangerous trail of financial irregularities, suspicious contracts, and shell company payments that threatened to expose something much bigger than comedy beefs or backstage politics. A man who, like Reggie, may have been digging too deep into Katt's business dealings, especially into Onyx LLC, and what he found might have been enough to trigger the panic that set this deadly cycle into motion. Corey's death was brushed aside years ago, dismissed as a tragic accident, but now insiders are whispering a darker truth: that Corey Dixon was silenced. His life ended abruptly, not because of chance, but because he was the first liability, the first name on what some now call Katt's invisible hit list. And what makes this revelation even more disturbing is that Katt's public image of chaos might have been the perfect disguise all along, because while fans and tabloids laughed at his rants, his arrests, and his wild behavior, that chaos distracted everyone from the possibility that something far more calculated was happening behind closed doors, something organized and deliberate, where each outburst became camouflage for darker moves in the background. And it was only when Reggie Carroll began connecting dots that the mask slipped, because sources close to Reggie say he had begun noticing strange financial patterns and asking the wrong questions, and suddenly his behavior changed. He stopped attending after-parties, became distant, and even warned close friends that he was on the verge of exposing something huge, something that would shake comedy and Hollywood itself. But before he could, his life ended in a flash, and soon after came the bombshell confession of Trenell Maris Williams, Katt's trusted bodyguard, who, under pressure from investigators, admitted the unthinkable: that Katt himself ordered hits to protect his empire, first on Corey Dixon, then on Reggie Carroll. And while those words alone sent shockwaves across the internet, Trenell backed them up with what he claimed were encrypted messages, suspicious payments, and references to taking care of problems, suggesting this wasn't random violence but a calculated pattern designed to eliminate threats. And suddenly the persona of Katt Williams as the uncontrollable king of chaos no longer looked like an act of comedy. It looked like strategy, a long-running performance to cover a darker reality. And as the widow's emotional accusation in court reignited public outrage, as forums and TikTok videos exploded with theories about Corey being the first victim and Reggie second, the narrative shifted from scandal to conspiracy, with fans asking how many names had been silenced, how many secrets buried, and just how deep Katt's empire of chaos really went. Because if Corey Dixon was the first target, if Reggie Carroll was the second, then the haunting question left: Behind is who else might have been on the list. And how much longer can Hollywood shield its stars before the truth tears everything apart? As the investigation deepened, whispers about Corey Dixon's death began to resurface, and what was once brushed aside as an unfortunate tragedy now looked like the first domino in a much larger and darker chain of events. Because Corey wasn't just some random associate in the industry, he was someone who had been close enough to Katt Williams to notice things that didn't add up. And according to sources, he had begun piecing together financial anomalies tied to Onyx Owl LLC, contracts that were bloated, sponsorship money that vanished into thin air, and shell corporations that connected back to names that had no business being linked to a comedian's clothing brand. And while most in Hollywood were too busy chasing fame or securing their next paycheck, Corey allegedly was preparing to go public with what he'd uncovered, making him, in the eyes of Katt's empire, a dangerous liability, the kind of man who couldn't be allowed to speak. So when his life was cut short, it was explained away as coincidence, as bad timing, but now investigators believe it was deliberate, a calculated test run to prove the machine worked, and the silence around his death shows just how effective that machine was, because no one questioned it deeply at the time. No one wanted to believe their favorite comedian could be connected to something so sinister, but the truth rarely stays buried forever, and years later, when Reggie Carroll began walking down that same path of discovery, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Reggie had been part of Katt's Heaven on Earth tour, billed as the comeback that would put him back on top of the comedy world. But while the lights on stage burned bright behind the curtains, Reggie started noticing the same red flags Corey once had: unusual payments to unknown entities, expenses that didn't match the reality of the tour, security measures that seemed less about protection and more about surveillance, and the presence of men who weren't listed on official payrolls but shadowed the crew as if they were watching rather than guarding. Insiders now claim Reggie stumbled across a USB drive containing confidential financial data, one that detailed offshore accounts and transfers linked not only to Katt's brand, but to other powerful figures in Hollywood. And once Reggie realized what he was holding, his demeanor shifted completely. He grew distant, skipped parties, avoided unnecessary interactions, and began dropping cryptic hints to those closest to him that he was about to blow the lid off something massive, something bigger than comedy, something that could shake the entire industry if exposed. And that was when the real fear set in, because like Corey before him, Reggie had crossed an invisible line, transforming from colleague to liability, and those who knew him say the tension in his final days was undeniable. Friends remember him whispering warnings, telling them to look at contracts if something happened to him, to watch the sponsors and ask who stood to lose the most if the truth came out. Chilling words that in hindsight feel less like paranoia and more like prophecy, because on August 20th, inside Onyx Owl LLC, his voice was silenced forever, and the empire Katt had built now stood at the center of one of the most disturbing scandals Hollywood had ever seen. But even that wasn't the most shocking part, because when Katt's bodyguard, Katt Williams, finally broke under pressure and confessed, he painted a picture of deliberate planning, describing Corey Dixon's death as the first job, and Reggie's as the one that mattered most, claiming Katt gave instructions in encrypted messages and paid out large sums through untraceable routes, effectively turning Trenell into both an executioner and a witness. And suddenly what had seemed like whispers became evidence that tied two deaths to one man at the center of it all. The FBI, according to leaks, began examining digital trails, cross-checking phone data, looking at suspicious financial activity in the weeks before both deaths, and each clue only made the narrative darker, because it suggested these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader network: control, intimidation, and silence, a system designed to protect not just Katt but the interests of those around him who profited from the chaos. And if Reggie had truly prepared to expose it, then his death wasn't just personal, it was business, a necessary act to protect an empire built on shaky ground. Meanwhile, Hollywood's silence grew louder, with insiders refusing to comment, comedians staying quiet, and managers avoiding the subject altogether. But on the internet, the floodgates had opened, fans dissecting every leak, drawing connections between Corey and Reggie, and speculating how many others might have been threatened into silence, while conspiracy theories pointed to an even bigger web involving promoters, sponsors, and backroom deals. The kind of corruption that could topple reputations and end careers overnight. And as this chaos spread, the image of Katt Williams as the wild, unpredictable comic transformed into something much more sinister, with people now asking if his persona of madness had been a smokescreen all along. A carefully maintained mask that let him move pieces in the dark, while everyone else assumed he was too reckless to plan anything so calculated. But now that mask was slipping, and behind it was not a clown but a strategist. A man who allegedly ordered hits not once but twice, and maybe even more. What makes this part of the story so chilling is not just the deaths of Corey Dixon and Reggie Carroll, but the implication that both men died because they got too close to the truth, because they held evidence that could destroy the empire Katt had built. And if that's true, then the laughter he sold to millions was nothing more than a cover for silence, betrayal, and blood. And so, the question haunting everyone now is how far this web extends, because if Corey was the first target and Reggie the second, then who else knew too much? Who else might have been threatened? And how much longer can the secrets of Hollywood remain hidden before the entire house of cards collapses in public view? By the time the story reached court, the atmosphere was electric, the kind of moment where Hollywood's glitz collided head-on with its darkest secrets, and in the middle of it all stood Katt Williams, no longer just the loud, chaotic comedian people once laughed at, but now a man whose name was tied to words like conspiracy, racketeering, and murder for hire. And when Reggie Carroll's wife broke down on the stand, pointing her finger and crying out that Katt Williams had orchestrated her husband's death, the courtroom froze, because it wasn't just grief spilling out, it was an accusation that echoed across newsrooms and social media like a thunderclap, reigniting speculation that had been growing ever since Corey Dixon's name was dragged back into the light. Speculation that painted a picture of two men silenced for getting too close to secrets hidden inside Onyx Owl LLC. And for the first time, the world wasn't laughing at Katt's antics. They were staring at him as a possible mastermind of a deadly empire. What made this trial even more explosive was the evidence the prosecution hinted at, but had yet to fully reveal. Encrypted messages allegedly traced back to Katt's phone, financial records suggesting hush money payments to key witnesses, and most chilling of all, the testimony of Trenell Merritt Williams, the bodyguard who had once stood at Katt's side like a shadow, now standing before the court describing in detail how Corey Dixon's death had been treated as a warning shot, and how Reggie Carroll had been marked as the main threat. Words that painted a haunting narrative of an empire willing to sacrifice lives in order to keep its secrets buried. Outside the courthouse, protests grew louder each day, with fans divided between those convinced Katt was the victim of a setup and those who believed the walls were finally closing in on him. And on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, millions dissected every leak, every testimony, and every court sketch, treating the trial like the biggest reality show Hollywood had ever produced. Except this time the stakes weren't fame or fortune, but freedom, justice, and the truth about whether one of comedy's most famous faces had turned into something far darker behind the scene. The FBI involvement only added to the weight of the case, As agents confirmed, they were examining a string of suspicious financial transfers that matched the timeline of Corey Dixon's and Reggie Carroll's deaths, and whispers emerged that more sealed evidence existed, possibly linking Katt brand to organized crime figures who had the power to make inconvenient people vanish, raising the chilling possibility that if Reggie had lived long enough to release what he knew, it wouldn't just have destroyed Katt's career, it could have shaken the very foundations of Hollywood's power structure. And yet, for every piece of evidence that seemed to corner Katt, his defenders pointed to gaps, to missing footage, to the possibility that Trennell was scapegoating his former boss to save himself, fueling conspiracy theories that perhaps Katt wasn't the mastermind but a pawn in an even bigger game, a distraction while unseen hands pulled the real strings. But whether Katt was a pawn or a king, the fact remained that two men were dead, Corey Dixon and Reggie Carroll, both of whom had hinted they were about to expose secrets, both of whom died before they could go public, and the eerie similarities between their final days became impossible to ignore, distancing themselves from friends, dropping cryptic warnings, isolating as though they sensed the danger circling closer, and then vanishing in violence, leaving behind only fragments of what they had uncovered. For the public, those fragments became fuel, and online communities began connecting names, sponsors, and companies, producing sprawling charts that claimed to expose a Hollywood hit network. And while many dismissed them as conspiracy theories, the fact that so much lined up with what was coming out in court made them harder to ignore. As the trial stretched on, insiders whispered that more names might surface, that Corey Dixon and Reggie Carroll were only the beginning, and the haunting thought spread. How many other voices had been silenced over the years, written off as accidents, overdoses, or random acts of violence, when in reality they were part of a system designed to protect an empire of money and power. And through it all, Katt sat in the defendant's chair, sometimes smiling defiantly, sometimes scribbling notes, sometimes staring into space as though the chaos around him was just another act in a comedy routine. But no amount of bravado could change the fact that this time the punchline was deadly serious. The internet crowned the trial Hollywood's darkest stage, a show where the script was written in whispers, blood, and betrayal, and as testimony piled up, it became harder and harder to believe that the King of Chaos was just a performer caught in the wrong storm. Instead, he looked more and more like the storm itself, a man who turned unpredictability into a weapon, who used his chaotic image as a shield while he allegedly plotted in silence, ensuring that those who threatened him met the same fate as Corey Dixon and Reggie Carroll. And so the final question loomed over everything like a shadow. Would the truth finally come out, or would Hollywood once again bury its secrets under the glitter of fame and the noise of distraction? Because if Corey was the first target and Reggie the second, then there was nothing stopping people from wondering if more names were out there, if more lives had already been claimed by the same web of corruption, and if the laughter that once made Katt Williams a star was nothing more than mask hiding a legacy built not on comedy, but on silence and fear.